Yeah.
Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum. Just for those of you here today, please may you turn your mobile phones off or to silent. I should hear the rustling of people doing that. In the event of a fire, we plan none of those for today. Follow the running man signs located at the back or the side of the room, and we can escort you safely to the front of the building. There will be time for questions at the end of this talk. If you do have a question for our speaker, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you. Today, I'm delighted to be introducing Damien Lewis, who is a former war reporter and award-winning author, topping bestseller lists worldwide. Among his many popular non-fiction titles are the SAS series, including Great Escapes, Forged in Hell, and Ghost Patrol. Recently, his work was adapted into the major Hollywood blockbuster, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Damien is here today to talk about his latest book, SAS Daggers Drawn, the final in Damien's Paddy, Maine trilogy. We will be selling copies of the book at the National Army Museum bookshop just up the stairs. You can head up there following the talk where Damien will be kindly signing copies. With all that said now, I'll pass over to Damien and I hope you'll enjoy the talk. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
So that all sounds very glamorous. This is the reality. Last week, I was in Northern Ireland, in Newtonards, which is the hometown of Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Maine, who was the commander of the SAS for most of the war, giving a talk, actually raising money for the local museum. We raised £20,000 in the evening. But this is the point. At the end of speaking for 45 minutes, I opened the floor to questions. And the first question, in a broad Ulster accent, which I won't do very well, was, "Tell us something we don't know." I mean, I thought I'd done rather well. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to tell you something you really will not know. And I told them a story which everyone found jaw-dropping because they honestly, generally had not heard, the slightest hint of that story before. And if you want to know that story, I'll tell you at the end. Ask me in the Q&A. But for now, I want to ask you all a question. Okay, so I want someone to tell me what is a gaff? Gaff. What is a gaff? Does anybody know what a gaff is? Yes? Thank you. It's also used for dragging fish out of the water, yes? So if you've caught a very large fish and you can't get it out of the water, a gaff is a huge long hook that you use to drag it out of the water with. That's the classic concept of what a gaff is. But a gaff is also, or a gaff was used as the code name for one of the most incredible SAS operations of the war, and I hope it's one that you haven't heard of before. So, as you all know, in the hours before D-Day and in the immediate aftermath of D-Day, patrols of SAS were dropped into Nazi-occupied France, parachuted in, to carry out these sabotage operations behind the lines. And the concept was really simple, and it was classic SAS modus operandi. So their mission was to basically ambush trains, road convoys, armoured columns, anything that would stop Hitler and Nazi Germany getting their forces to the Normandy beaches and driving us back into the sea. That was their mission. Okay? One of those patrols was commanded by Major Bill Fraser, who was an SAS original, highly decorated, standout figure of the SAS by now, one of Paddy Maine's really trusted deputies. So he deployed into the Morvan area of France, which is kind of southeast of Paris. Heavily forested, quite hilly, quite high, 3,000 feet high, very remote, somewhere where they figured you could set up a whole SAS squadron, cause havoc and mayhem behind the lines, but have pretty secure bases in which to retreat when you've carried out your operations. And it was from that operation, from the Morvan operations, that Operation Gaff had its beginning. And its birth was really quite extraordinary. Dropped in alongside the SAS was a guy called Sir James Hutchinson. Sir James Hutchinson was not SAS. He was from the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, Churchill's Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare, the ministry set up to do all the things you're not allowed to do in warfare, under the rules of warfare. So that's assassinations, bribery, corruption, money laundering, smuggling, you name it, the SOE was set up to do it. Because Churchill, in my view, rightfully believed World War II was a total war, Hitler was fighting a total war, and we had to do likewise. So Sir James Hutchinson was an agent of SOE, and he was dropped in with a mission to co-locate himself with the French resistance, to call in by radio airdrops of weaponry to arm the French resistance so they could fight alongside the SAS and be a false multiplier. Okay? However, Sir James Hutchinson found out something quite extraordinary. One of the men he was working with, one of the French resistance leaders, happened to be a French nobleman, and he actually owned a chateau to the northwest of Paris. And he still had workers tending the grounds in that chateau, and they knew the workers in the neighbouring chateau, and they talked to each other, and it turned out the neighbouring chateau happened to be the headquarters of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel just happened to be the German commander orchestrating the German defences along the whole of the northern coast of France, from the Normandy landings all the way practically to the border of Germany. So clearly, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was a key target. And at that stage, the Normandy landings hadn't gone as we had hoped and predicted. We had hoped and predicted that the breakout from the beachheads would be fairly quick. It had not proven that way at all. In fact, we were bogged down in really vicious, difficult fighting. So something was needed to break the impasse. So Sir James Hutchinson found out where Erwin Rommel's headquarters was. And the first thing he did was he took that information to Bill Fraser, the commander of A Squadron SAS in the Morvan, because they'd built a great relationship together. And Bill Fraser said, I mean, let's not forget the fact that the SAS and the Africa Corps, which Rommel had commanded in North Africa, had a certain history. Because, of course, the SAS had waged war in the North African desert very successfully for 18 months after its formation in the summer of 1941, but their chief adversary had been Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. So you could argue there was bad blood between the SAS and Rommel. Not only that, but Bill Fraser, even before that, when he'd served in the British Expeditionary Force in the ultimate abortive defence of France, his regiment had been captured pretty much en masse by Erwin Rommel. Bill Fraser was one of the few to escape, so he had a double reason to want to go after Erwin Rommel. So he radios London and he says, we found out where Erwin Rommel's headquarters is. He's my pigeon. We're going to go and get him. So he's asking for clearance. Now, just let me explain to you what Bill Fraser going to get Erwin Rommel would have entailed. From the Morvan to where Erwin Rommel's chateau headquarters was would be about an 800-kilometre round trip through Nazi-occupied France. They had a few, just a handful, maybe 6 jeeps parachuted in to the Morvan, so they had a few vehicles they could use. So by anyone's reckoning, the concept that you would drive 800 kilometres through enemy-occupied France, kill, or better still, kidnap Erwin Rommel, and then drive him all the way back to the Morvan was something of a mission impossible. But even so, Bill Fraser radios headquarters and says, we found out where Rommel's headquarters is. He's our pigeon. We're going to go and get him. Rightfully, Paddy, Maine and the other commanders at SS headquarters say, you're doing a great job in the Morvan. That is your key priority, and going after Erwin Rommel with respect. 1, it's not what you're there to do, and 2, that is just going to end in disaster, and it's a suicide mission. We're going to stand up a bespoke force to parachute in and get him. Now, Bill Fraser's really, really not very happy. Bill Fraser radios London headquarters and says, the only reason you're doing this is because Paddy Maine wants to go in and get Rommel for himself. That's honestly what Bill Fraser says, right? Anyway, he loses the argument for all the right reasons. The chances of them going 800 kilometres across enemy-occupied France and pulling off that mission are pretty much 0. And instead what happens is Paddy Maine stands up this 6-strong force to parachute into that region and to go and kill or ideally kidnap and bring back to Britain. That's their orders, General Erwin Rommel. And the reason why the orders are ideally to bring back to Britain, kidnap and bring back to Britain, are because they believed it would be a fantastic propaganda coup if they could bring Rommel back alive. And it's obvious why that would be the case. It would have been a fantastic propaganda coup. And the logistics of doing so, it may sound like something which is absolutely impossible, but actually, when you drill down into it, as long as they could get hold of him, the mechanism was there already, because the SOE were well versed by now, we're talking, July 1944, in flying in these tiny brilliant short takeoff and landing Lysander-light aircraft, landing on remote French fields, dropping agents and picking up agents and flying them back to the UK. So if you do that with an SOE agent, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't do it with Field Marshal Rommel. So that's the plan that's put in place. And the orders are, ideally, to kidnap and bring back to Britain. But if you think you are going to fail to kidnap and bring him back to Britain, then kill him. It's one or the other. And if you can't succeed in the former, succeed in the latter. The team they stand up consists of probably one of the most unorthodox units that's ever been put together in the history of warfare. So the commander is a chap called Raymond Couraud. Couraud is a dual French-American national. His mother was American, his father was French. He'd been brought up half in Paris and half in Pennsylvania. When he was 18, he'd volunteered for the French Foreign Legion. At the start of the war, he'd been soldiering with the French Foreign Legion in Norway, won a High Valor Medal, storming a German machine gun nest. Then, when France capitulated, he refused to serve in the French Foreign Legion under the Vichy French regime for reasons you can understand, and instead became a gangster in the Marseille underworld. And basically, whilst in Marseille, he met, and they fell in love, he met the glittering, beautiful, fabulously wealthy American-French socialite Mary Jane Gold, who was also based in Marseille at the time. And so, because Mary Jane Gold was based in Marseille, helping run the Emergency Rescue Committee, which, as some of you know, was the organization they set up to get Jews out of Nazi-occupied France and get them safely to America, Couraud, having fallen in love with Mary Jane Gould, decides he will use his underground network, so his gangster network, to help that operation. And together, Mary Jane Gould and Couraud get about 2,000 Jews out of Nazi-occupied France. And then finally, of course, their network is penetrated by the Gestapo. Now, Mary Jane Gould is at that time the citizen of a neutral nation because she's American, and America is still neutral, so she can just go back to America to escape the Gestapo. Couraud, of course, has none of those protections. So what he does is he executes the most incredible, daring escape, gets to the UK, volunteers for the Special Operations Executive. He's a perfect recruit, speaks fluent English, fluent French. They drop him back into France as an assassin, carries out several assassination operations, eventually gets unmasked by the Gestapo, has a firefight with 3 Gestapo agents in Paris, kills them all, gets back to the UK, and at that stage the SOE say, you can no longer serve for us anymore because the Gestapo know who you are, they know your name and likeness, and at that stage he volunteers for the SAS. Incidentally, just apropos of nothing, Sir James Hutchinson, the SOE agent who's discovered Rommel, right? He has, even before that, he had been serving with the SOE. He had also been captured by the Gestapo. They'd also found out who he was. He'd also escaped and got back to Britain. And the SOE had said to him, you can no longer deploy into the field as an agent because they found out who you are, they know your name, and you have your photograph. So Sir James Hutchinson's response to that was to go to a Harley Street surgeon, have plastic surgery, to the extent that when he went home after the plastic surgery, his own children did not recognize him. Then he went back to SOE headquarters and said, can I now deploy? And obviously, because he was no longer recognizable, they allowed him to deploy. That's how he was in the Morvan, okay? So Couraud and Sir James Hutchinson, they are, you know, they're those kind of characters. Under his command, Couraud has 4 former French Foreign Legionnaires like himself. One is Fedosev, a Russian. Another is a chap called Max Mark, who is a German Jew, obviously fluent German speaker. And the SAS had made it one of their kind of like rules of operations. From the very earliest operations, they'd realized because they were formed to think the unthinkable and do the unthinkable. Because if you thought the unthinkable and did the unthinkable and attacked the enemy in unthinkable ways, the enemy by default would never think you would attack them in that way, so therefore it had great chances of being successful, okay? And one of the ways they thought of doing the unthinkable was always to have a fluent German speaker on their patrols, because when they reached that desert air base and they got to the perimeter and they were challenged, that person could answer, convince the guards that they were really a German patrol, and they could get through undetected, okay? So there's a German Jew called Max Mark on the team as well. There's also one lone Englishman, a guy called Corporal Tom Moore. And Stephen, his grandson, who has been to some of my talks about this operation, contacted me about a year ago, and we met and talked about Operation Gaff and his grandfather's role on it. His grandfather told the family nothing about what he had done in the war, ever. He never spoke about it. It's so common with families that, you know, these guys came back from these incredible behind-the-lines operations, just never spoke about it. And so, working with Stephen, we've unearthed some of the history. And one of the real kind of mysteries of Operation Gaff is, why was this lone Englishman selected? Because if you are in the French Foreign Legion, if you're serving in the French Foreign Legion, you can't be French and be in the French Foreign Legion. You have to be non-French, but the lingua franca of the Legion is French. So everybody in the French Foreign Legion speaks fluent French. But Corporal Moore was never in the French Foreign Legion, wasn't a French speaker. So we don't know why he was selected. What we can say is that one of the things he carried out on Operation Gaff was really quite extraordinary. So these 6 men have stood up. It's a rather unorthodox force for a rather unorthodox mission. They pack with them sniper rifles and plastic explosives. The intelligence on Rommel's movements is really, really detailed. They know that he goes out very early in the morning in his staff car to visit frontline positions. He then comes home and back to his chateau, and then in the afternoon gets on a motorboat, crosses the Seine River, because the chateau's on the banks of the Seine, goes hunting in the woods on the far side, comes back, has his evening meal, sits out on the terrace of the chateau of an evening and enjoys a couple of glasses of wine. So, the plan of attack is as follows. Either you nab him and kidnap him when he's hunting in the woodland, okay? And if you can't do that, and if you can get a clean shot at him on the terrace, that's where you assassinate him. So that's the plan that they are parachuted into France to execute, okay? They're dropped in the wrong place. That happens all the time. Little deterred. They set off on foot. Halfway to the chateau, they get what to them is shattering news. Because the intelligence the SAS have gathered on Rommel's headquarters has been disseminated across all forces. So the RAF have been alerted. And an RAF flight has been over that chateau, seen a staff car, attacked the staff car. It happened to be carrying Rommel, okay? The driver's been killed. The car's hit a tree. Rommel's been thrown free of the car, very badly injured in the accident. So he's now in hospital. So he is beyond their reach, and their operation is now null and void. Now, you or I might imagine at that stage, you think, phew, don't have to go and die carrying out this suicide operation. No. Karaud is beside himself with rage. He was a very fiery individual. And let's be frank about it. You know, the French had far more reason than us to fight. Their land was occupied. Their people were under the Nazi jackboot, okay? So he burns to fight, you know. And it's really interesting, talking to Stephen, the grandson of Corporal Moore, one of the things he said to me was, if the RAF hadn't got Rommel, and if that 6-man team had been sent in to get him, would I be alive? Because clearly the chances of any of them coming out alive were very, very, very low. So at that stage, you might imagine they'd say, well, Rommel's been got, you know, our mission's over, let's go try and go home. Not a bit of it. What they proceed to do is launch a series of freelance DIY sabotage operations in which they derail 2 trains, okay? One of them, Corporal Moore, with a Bren gun on his own, shoots up the locomotive, stops the train, and then they radio in an airstrike, and the train is blown up the next morning. They also sabotage and attack 2 or 3 German road convoys, kill some senior German officers, including a Gestapo officer, and by now they're kind of running a bit short of explosive and ammunition. So Karaud decides their final grand finale of Operation Gaff, they will attack the nearest German field headquarters to the chateau, where they hope some of Rommel's senior officers will be based. Okay? So it's a heavily defended target. How are they going to do so? It's at night. They flit their way through the town streets, they get to the base, and the German speaker, Max Marx, goes to the gate, speaks to the gate guard, obviously in fluent German, convinces the gate guard that this is a friendly patrol returning to base. The gate is opened. He knifes to death the German sentry, and then they open fire on the headquarters. And when they're all out of ammunition, they flit away into the town again. They are now, obviously, being intensely hunted. There's 6 men on the run with almost no ammunition left. So Couraud's answer to that conundrum is to get a gendarme's uniform, dress himself as a French gendarme, get a bicycle, cycle all the way through Nazi-occupied France to the German front line, bluff his way across the front line. This is a true story, by the way, completely documented. Okay, gets across the German front line, gets to the American front line, hands over a large dossier of intelligence to the Americans of targets that they now need to get airstrikes in to hit, and then proceeds to get all 5 of his men safely out of Nazi-occupied France, and they emerge from Operation Gaff without a scratch on any of them. That's the story of Operation Gaff. Okay? It's one mission that was catalyzed by and orchestrated from Bill Fraser's A Squadron SAS in the Morvan. But it's just one of many. It was one of the most successful operations carried out by the SAS in the summer of 1944. And bear in mind, SAS patrols have been dropped all across the length and breadth of Nazi-occupied France carrying out these kind of operations. So to give you an indication of some of the kind of missions that they carried out, they learn that there is a fuel plant, a synthetic fuel plant, to the south of their Morvan base. It's about 80 kilometres south. So they get in a jeep, one jeep. It's commanded by Alex Muirhead and Wellstead. Okay? There's about 4 men in the jeep. They drive the jeep 80 kilometres through enemy territory at night. They get to the fuel plant in the depths of night. They drive onto a field. They set up an 81mm or 3-inch mortar. They lob in about 60 mortar rounds to the plant. The German defenders, obviously they can't conceive it's the SAS attacking them with a mortar, so they proceed, it's an air raid, and the searchlights are going up there, shooting up their anti-aircraft weapons into the air, and then the SAS close the mortar down, clear away any signs that they've been there, and drive their way back to their base. The Germans had absolutely no idea who had attacked them or how. It's as if a beast from the night had emerged and mysteriously laid waste to their plant. A month later, they learn the plant has been repaired and is up and running again. So they do exactly the same thing. They return, they set the mortar up, but this time, because they're like, no, this time we've got to take it out of action permanently, this time some of the men fight their way into the plant, get into some of the key facilities and plant plastic explosives. That's one operation. Another operation goes to the east of the Morvan, towards Dijon, and it's commanded by Johnny Weissman, one of the SAS founders, really, really hugely experienced individual. And to give you an indication of how it was one of the most, I mean, one thing we need to understand, and I'm sure you do, is that this is no longer this is not a pleasant war anymore. I mean, the war was never pleasant, but North Africa, you could argue, was to a certain extent a kind of gentlemanly warfare, wide open spaces, no civilians, we're going to get few civilians, we're going to get killed. France is not like that at all. And it's terrible for these individuals because what they've realized very quickly, very, very quickly, from the first successful sabotage operation they've realized, they blew up, the first thing they did was they shot up a convoy, very successfully, right? Shot up a convoy, but the Germans sent in reinforcements to try and hunt them down. Of course, they don't find the SAS because by now they've perfected their hit and run operations to the nth degree. But they're enraged and they know they've got their backs to the wall and they know that they are now on the losing end of this war. So what do? They lay waste to the nearest French village. Terrible things are happening. Men, women and children, the village priest. So these young men, some of whom are still in their teens. You know, I interviewed Alec Boy-Borry, who was one of the last 2 surviving members of the SAS from the war. I interviewed him February in 2023. His nickname was Alec Boy-Borry, boy, because he lied about his age to sign up. He was 16 when he signed up. He was 18 when he joined the SAS. He's 19 years old when he's in the Morvan, carrying out these kind of operations. So those kind of individuals of that kind of youth know that every time they carry out a successful raid, that's what's very likely going to happen to any French villagers that the enemy can round up. This is a huge, difficult burden to bear. But Johnny Weissman sets off to the east towards Dijon, as I say. And they get to this area, to give you an indication of how close they are to the nearest German garrison. when they go in the morning to the local French farm to buy their eggs, they have to make sure they don't bump into the Germans who are also going to the same farm to buy their eggs and milk. That's how close they are to the enemy, okay? And from there, they derail several trains. They get into and blow up another fuel plant, hugely successful operation. And eventually, they're not exactly betrayed, because that would be the wrong word to use in my view. What happens is a young French resistance fighter who's been working with them gets captured. He's tortured. Eventually talks and betrays where their base is. And so the enemy think, well, it's only like 6 SAS. What's the worst that can happen? So they send in a force of the milice. And the milice were the opposite of the French resistance. These are the pro-fascist collaborators with Nazi Germany. They send in a force of the milice, and they turn up at dawn. They think, 6 SS, what's the worst that can happen? The few milice who survive come out thinking very differently. Very few of them get out alive. So they then go and get the German military and say, right, okay, now we need a force of milice and German military because these guys are serious. They return the next morning at dawn to attack Johnny Weissman's base, but Johnny Weissman by now has disappeared. There are no SAS in that area anymore. They've just moved to another camp that they'd pre-prepared. So the milice go in from one side at dawn, the German troops go in from the other side at dawn. They can't find any SAS, but they see each other. And they mistake each other for the SAS. They end up in a massive firefight, and 22 of the enemy are killed at their own hand before they finally realize that they are shooting up their own side. Okay? Another patrol goes to the north of Dijon, and it's commanded by Captain Roy Bradford, standout commander of the SAS. They've got one jeep that they can take with them. It's battle-worn. It can do 30 miles an hour top speed. And because of that, and because they're taking around about a 20-strong force to this area that they know that the Germans are using to send really, really important ammunition trains through to Normandy beaches, that's why they're going there. So because they can only take one jeep with about 5 men in it, the rest of the patrol are cycling their way 80 kilometers north on parabikes. And parabikes were these bicycles made in Birmingham, okay, which were foldable, so you could parachute them into theatre, and you could cycle to where you needed to get to. That was the theory. So there's 15 men commanded by Jeff Duvivier, standout or SS original, cycling their way north, but Captain Bradford in his jeep. That jeep almost gets to the base of operations where they're going to start their sabotage missions, and they come around the corner, it's pretty much dawn, and there's a convoy of 12 German trucks parked up at the roadside with a mass of German troops having breakfast. The road is too narrow to turn around. So they think, well, we'll continue. So they shoot the column up with their jeep-mounted machine guns. Remember, they can only do 30 miles an hour. That's top speed they can do. They reach the last truck. They think they've got away with it. And then a German machine gunner finds his aim. He kills Captain Bradford, 2 other on the jeep, and the rest are wounded bar 1, and they have to try and escape. But meanwhile, Jeff Duvivier's bicycle-mounted patrol are still heading off, oblivious to what's happened, to the base of operations. A few days later, they arrive there. There's no sign of the jeep. There's no sign of Captain Bradford, but they hear a really, really loud explosion echoing from just to the north of there. So Jeff Duvivier thinks, well, what was that? We need to investigate. So they make contact with the local French resistance. They find out the French resistance have blown up a railway line because they know a 40-carriage German ammunition train is about to pass through, and by blowing up the railway line, they can delay it. So Jeff Duvivier thinks, well, we can do better than that. So what they do is they go to that area of railway line, and they plant their explosives with these devices called fog signals. And what the fog signals did, they're actually something that's been used for a very long time on the railways. They're actually, when they're used in civilian use, they're to warn a train driver there's fog up ahead, hence been called fog signals. But the SAS and the SOE adapted them so that you could use the fog signal to trigger a charge of explosives in front of a speeding train. Does that make sense? Rather than blowing up the explosives beneath the train, you blow it up in front of the train. The reason you do that is if you can blow the stretch of railway line in front of the train, you are guaranteed a derailment. Do you understand? Because the train, at high speed, hits an area of track that no longer exists. It's been proven to be the best way to blow up a train. That's exactly what they do. They plant a fog signal, they plant their explosives, they disguise it all, they go back to their base. They get a radio call from headquarters from Bill Fraser saying, Captain Bradford's been killed, call off your operation, return to base. And as they're getting on their bikes to cycle all the way back to the Morvan, they hear a massive explosion. That train, that 40-strong train has hit that fog signal, and 25 carriages has been, the locomotive, plus 25 carriages have been derailed. And not only that, there's another train, 40 strong, loaded with ammunition just behind it, which now can't get through. Imagine what effect that has on the Allied war effort. Imagine what effect all those operations have on stopping the enemy from getting their reinforcements and supplies to the Normandy beaches. Okay? At the end of the SAS operations in France, I'm aware of time, the General Eisenhower and Montgomery both send fulsome letters of congratulations to the SS. Eisenhower, in fact, says, of any unit of your size, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, the SS has had more impact on the war in France, the war to liberate France, than just about any other force of a similar size. So they've received absolutely fulsome praise. And France is liberated. And it's a war of liberation. That's the key point. The French people are pretty much all on our side. And it's the thing about guerrilla operations, and these really are, that's really what the SAS is all about. It's guerrilla operations at heart. The thing about guerrilla operations is this, okay? You need one of two things to exist if they are to be successful. The first, ideally, is you're operating in a huge open space where nobody lives, like the North African desert. If you're operating in the North African desert, you have places you can return to after your raid where you can recuperate and hide and make your base. So when the SAS were in North Africa, for example, they made one of their bases in the Great Sand Sea. This area the size of Ireland, just sand dunes, deserted. No one believes you can navigate it or live there. They live there. Perfect kind of terrain in which to base these kind of operations. But if you don't have that, if you don't have areas which are devoid of human population, then you need the locals to be on your side. And you need the locals to be on your side because they must succor you, shelter you, and not betray you to the enemy, and ideally fight alongside you as a force multiplier. And that, largely, they had in France. They're not going to have that in Nazi Germany. And they realize this. In Nazi Germany, it's no longer this is no longer a campaign of liberation. You know, the German people have been brainwashed to a degree that it's so hard for us to understand and even contemplate. I'll give you one example. And even to me, it was like, this is so hard to kind of countenance and believe. When the SAS were sent into Nazi Germany in April 45, in one or two of the villages that they seized during their operations, they would be approached by the German women of the village. And they would say, when do we have to start learning English? And when do you take us back to England as your slaves? And that's what they believed was going to happen. They absolutely believed that would be their fate should Nazi Germany fall. And of course, you know, the SAS would say, well, we know what you're talking about, but, you know, you don't have to learn English, and, you know, obviously you're not going to be our slaves. And then they'd explain that in the UK, you can criticize the government, you can criticize the war effort, you can criticize Winston Churchill if you wish to. There is freedom of speech and freedom of association. And to these individuals, it was almost inconceivable to think of a life and a world in which there wasn't the SS, there wasn't the Gestapo, and there wasn't that iron control and brainwashing of a police state. Whilst they were in the Morvan, the SAS recruited two unusual individuals to their operations. Okay? One was a young, teenage German soldier called, oh golly, sorry, name's gone. We'll call him Hans, okay? And it was actually the Padre of the unit who kind of brought him into the fold. What happened was a German unit was sent in to attack a French resistance base, stumbled into the SAS by accident, and the SAS did what they do, and this young chap was one of the few survivors. And the Padre of the SS, the first Padre they ever had, Padre Fraser McCluskey, amazing man, a man who had only joined the SAS that spring of 44. And when they realized what their operations were going to be and that they were going to parachute behind the lines in France, the Padre had stepped forward and said, I am coming with you. And everyone said, well, don't be ridiculous, you're a Padre. You should stay back at base and, administer to our spiritual needs from base. He said, no, I am coming. And he parachuted into the Morvan with no weapon and with a container stuffed full of Bibles, a crucifix, and a maroon altar cloth on which he had a cross, obviously, but also the winged dagger cap badge of the SAS. And the first Sunday, he actually was able to give a church service in the midst of the Morvan, in the midst of the forest. He realized something about what he could bring to the table. And he realized that whether those individuals he was giving the service to were Christian, not Christian, had no faith, had another faith, it didn't matter. What his church service of a Sunday represented was a little tiny piece of normality and home and freedom. It was what they were all there fighting for. This was something tangible that they could hold on to and say, that is why we're here fighting behind the lines. And in fact, over time he realized, the Padre was one of the bravest of the lot of them, because not only was he there without a weapon, but because the flock was spread so wide, I told you, in Dijon, they were across hundreds of kilometers of terrain. Because they were spread so wide, and the Padre believed he had to minister to all of his flock, he was getting in a jeep with one bodyguard, himself carrying no weapon, and traveling all across Nazi-occupied France to carry out these sermons. And what he realized very quickly was the singing of the hymns would be in proportion to how close the enemy were to them. So if the enemy were close, the hymns would be muted and sung very softly. And when the enemy were far distant, they would be belted out at the tops of their lungs. And it's Padre McCluskey who, because he was at the heart of the unit, but in a way he was also an outsider, because he wasn't a combatant. And actually the men, he agonized over this. He had conversations with senior figures saying, what happens if I'm driving in my Jeep and my driver bodyguard gets killed? Am I then allowed to get on the machine guns and fight the enemy? And I don't know how to use the machine guns. And Reg Seekings, the guy he was talking to at the time, who was one of the original SAS, a really hard man, an army boxing champion, said, of course you're going to use the machine gun. I'll teach you how to use it. But he was kind of apart from them as well, and he was a great observer. And it was Padre McCluskey who realized in the Morvan, as he watched these men at operation, some of whom had been fighting behind enemy lines for 4 years now. Try and get your head around that. 4 years of back-to-back behind enemy lines operations. North Africa, Italy, now Nazi-occupied France. And Padre McCluskey realized as he's there watching these men, some of these men are on the verge of what they called at the time crapping out. Some of these men are on the verge of losing it. He could see the symptoms of what we would now recognize, let's be frank about it, as post-traumatic stress disorder. He could see it in the way they were behaving, in their nervousness, in their jumpiness. There was never a moment to relax in France. You could not relax in France. You could barely sleep there because the enemy were always hunting you. There was nowhere safe to go back to like there was in the North African desert and recuperate. And Padre McCluskey sees this. He's the individual who says to Paddy Maine's been banned from deploying. You can ask me why later. He doesn't accept the ban. He does some incredible things. But it's Padre McCluskey who says to Paddy Maine, you have to come into theatre because you need to see the state your men are in. You need to see your state your men are in. And you need to get another squadron into theatre to relieve a squadron because they, in my view, cannot last a great deal longer. Okay? But that's how knife-edge it was in Nazi-occupied France, where the local population are on your side. Imagine what it's like in Nazi Germany when everyone is the enemy and you know everyone's going to be the enemy. Not only that, who are the enemy in Nazi-occupied France? They are the Hitler Youth. So they're 14-year-old kids. They're the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, the German Home Guard, old men. They're remnants of elite paratrooper units, and all of them fighting suicidally and determined to give no quarter. So the push into Nazi-occupied Germany was bitter and bloody in the extreme. really, really, really hard fought. And the role the SAS were given in Nazi-occupied Germany was borderline inappropriate. So there was this huge debate beforehand. How do we use the SAS in the push into Nazi Germany? There was even a proposal that they would parachute behind the lines, dressed in civilian clothing, and carry out sabotage operations. Clearly suicide missions, because there weren't enough fluent German speakers. They would have been en masse very quickly. And eventually the role they're given is to act as the tip of the spear, so taking their unarmoured, open-top jeeps ahead of the massed ranks of Allied armour to try and crowbar open enemy lines and find a way through. It was so ridiculous, and ridiculous isn't quite the right word, but inappropriate, that when they formed up, their 20-strong Jeep convoy under Paddy, Maine in April 1945 to lead the charge, the Canadian and American tank commanders sat atop their Sherman tanks looking down at these open-top Jeeps were incredulous, and they nicknamed the SAS our friends in their little mechanized mess tins, because that's how crazy this idea was. But that is exactly what they proceeded to do. And actually, although they suffered heavy casualties, they did it with immense panache and with a great deal of success. I'm aware I'm running out of time. So just two things to talk about in Nazi Germany. The first is the mission in which Blair Paddy, Maine, arguably, in my view, should have been awarded the VC, the Victoria Cross, and was not. So they're not even 48 hours having crossed the German border, and they reach a German. Every inch of terrain is hard-fought, horrendous situations. And they reach this, they get to the outskirts of this village called Lorup. And the lead jeeps are ambushed in this ferocious ambush. And very quickly, Major Bond is killed. His driver is killed, trying to rescue him. And there's any number of SS who've bailed out of the jeeps, which are now completely destroyed. And they're in a ditch, there's wounded, and they are in a desperate situation. They're all either going to get captured or killed. And bear in mind, again, by now, they know what capture means. Capture doesn't mean capture and get taken to a prison of war camp under the Geneva Convention. Hitler has issued his commander order, and the commander order was any SAS or SOE captured behind enemy lines will only be kept alive for long enough for the Gestapo and SS to torture them, at the end of which they will be shot out of hand. So that was the order given to all his senior commanders. So they know by now that capture is a death sentence. I'll give you an indication of how much they know it. They know it to the degree that they have dispensed with their beige wing dagger cap badge the signature of being SAS. They've dispensed with anything which would prove they were SS. They don't even refer to themselves over the radio as being SAS because they know it's a death sentence. Okay? So those men in that ditch at Lorup, if they're captured, it's a death sentence as much as being killed on the ground. The radio message goes back to Paddy, Maine, in his Jeep with his driver, Billy Hull. Maine is incensed. There's a misconception about Paddy, Maine, that he was a mad, drunken Irishman. He was not. Yes, he liked to drink. And yes, he was a fighting Irishman with a fiery spirit like so many of them had. But the key thing about Paddy, Maine was his care for the men under his command that knew no bounds. So when he heard Dick Bond had been killed and his driver had also been killed, he races forward in his Jeep with Billy Hull at the wheel. He then mounts a solo operation himself with a Bren gun to clear the Germans out of the nearest buildings. And having done that, he gets back to his Jeep and says to everybody who's gathered there, who wants to have a go? He was asking for a volunteer. A chap called Scott, Lieutenant Scott, MC, already a famous escapee of the SAS, steps forward. He becomes Paddy Maine's rear gunner. Maine then proceeds to drive up that road, which we know is Suicide Alley, getting Scott to put down firearms to the enemy positions, goes past the ditch, says to the men in the ditch, don't worry, I'll be back to rescue you. Turns the Jeep around, comes back again, all the while putting down firearms to the enemy, gets back to his original start point, spins the Jeep around again, goes back for a second shoot up of the enemy, finally stops at the ditch, gets out of the Jeep, with Scott providing covering fire, lifts all the wounded out of the ditch, puts them in the Jeep, rescues his men, and drives them all back to where they started from. For that mission, the two officers on the ground who saw it happen wrote him up for a Victoria Cross. The Canadian commander of the tank regiment they are embedded with endorses the Victoria Cross, and Montgomery himself, by now Field Marshal, signs off on the Victoria Cross recommendation. And somebody, and we don't know who, we can't find out, in the citation crosses out the VC recommendation by hand and writes instead third bar to DSO. So in other words, Paddy Maine's fourth DSO, Distinguished Service Order. To give you an indication of how incomprehensible that was, David Stirling, when he was rescued a few days later from Colditz Castle, because David Stirling, the founder of the SAS, had been captured in 1943, David Stirling said of this, it's an outrage, but they were never going to give the Victoria Cross to a man like Paddy Maine, or indeed to the SAS, because we were so unpopular. And when Paddy Maine went to Buckingham Palace to get his third bar to DSO, the king himself says to Paddy Maine, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty much these words, I am mystified as to why the Victoria Cross has so strangely eluded you. So even the king himself could not understand why it had not been given. And this is the measure of the man. Paddy Maine's response was this, my liege, I served my king and my country to the best of my abilities, and that's all the honour I need. What a man. I've forgotten what I was also going to talk about. I'm 5 minutes over time. You're probably going to want to ask some questions. I'm going to stop there.
Give a round of applause, Stu, yeah. If you do have a question for Damien, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over to you.
Why was Paddy Maine initially not allowed to go to France after D-Day?
So, as I said, for some reason Hitler didn't like the SAS. He took it very personally. I'm being serious. The SS and the SOE, he really took it personally. So he'd authored the commando order. But not only that, he said, find out who all these people are. So by this time of the war, summer 44, they knew chapter and verse about Paddy Maine. They knew his name. They knew he was the commander of one SAS. They knew all his biography. And in fact, he was an Irish rugby international, a British and Irish Lions rugby international. So they said, High Command said it's too much of a risk for you to deploy into theatre. The story behind how he gets around that is brilliant. He says, look, when he's alerted to the fact that many of his men are in danger of suffering what we'd now recognise as PTSD, he says to his commanders, look, let me go and assess my men. The only way I can make this call is to be in the field. So they say to him, okay, you can deploy, but you stay in the rear with the gear. You take no risk whatsoever. Paddy says, yes, of course, as he would. He doesn't parachute into France. He flies over to the Normandy beachhead, gets in his jeep with Mike Sadler, the brilliant SAS navigator, as his navigator, drives through American lines, German lines, gets to the Morvan, that's 300 kilometers through enemy territory, right? Links up with the Padre, realizes how in danger his men are of losing it, hears about another SS patrol in which 31 men have disappeared. In fact, they're all murdered by the enemy, and decides to go and investigate, gets in his jeep, drives another 400 kilometers across France, gets to that area, investigates it, ends up crossing and recrossing the German lines about 4 times, bringing in, so C Squadron are brought in to relieve A Squadron. Paddy Maine's the guy who goes and gets them and brings them in. He takes the biggest risks of anyone whatsoever. And the way he gets away with it is when headquarters realise that he's not quite obeyed the sanction he was given, he just says, and it's in the radio transcripts, he just says, he's lost his radio. He literally goes off air for about 3 weeks. That's the way he gets away with it. So, no, sorry, I've got no way of making communications. That's how he goes and does these, and that's how he wins his 3rd Distinguished Order for his French operations.
Hi, yeah. I just wondered if there was any plan. I know there was quite a campaign to try and get him his VC. Is there any plans to try and reinvigorate that claim?
I was with somebody yesterday talking about it. Yeah, so there may well be. And there may well be a very well-known newspaper leading that campaign. Yeah, not to get it revisited, but to get a posthumous award. Because there were, for those of you who know, there was An Australian soldier was given a posthumous VC about 3 or 4 days ago for Operations Vietnam. So there's a precedent already. So yeah, it may well happen. Watch this space.
Is it possible to talk about your process when for example, with the Nazi hunters, it's a very unknown operation, and where do you kind of start with something like that?
Yeah, so obviously the research is everything. Daggers Drawn and the other 2 books in the trilogy, they came about because Paddy Maine, well, actually it wasn't Paddy Maine's family, it was a chap in Northern Ireland called Peter Forbes, who just contacted me out of blue and said, I'm one of the keepers of Paddy Maine's archive. Would you come over to Newton Ards and have a look at what's there? The reason they invited me was because they wanted to know, was there possibly one book that might be written based upon all the material that Paddy Maine had spent 5 years collecting behind enemy lines, which they held. That was the family archive. Might there possibly be a book in there, a book to tell the true story of who Paddy Maine really was? So, I went there and, stepped through the main household front entrance, and there's his war chest and his uniform and all the loot, the German binoculars with the swastikas on them and everything in between. And one of those moments where you don't really feel as if maybe you're worthy to do this, take this on. And anyway, that ended up being 3 books. So it's really, really, really crucial to get the family to support these projects. You almost couldn't do it without them. I mean, seriously. So when we launched Daggers Drawn about 3 weeks ago on HMS Belfast, the IWM site, we had 6. The families of 6 of the individuals in the book were there. So Padre McCluskey's 2 sons were there. They had read the manuscript at an early stage and helped me research and write it. And there were 6 other families who had, grandsons and children there. Really, really, really important, because we've pretty much lost, let's be honest about it, all the World War II veterans, certainly from the SAS. So that immediate first-hand testimony is gone. I mean, I'm staying in London at the Victory Services Club, and yesterday I went to the loo, came back upstairs, and there before me, by pure chance, was Jack Mann. Some of you may know who Jack Mann is. He is the last surviving member, as we understand it, of the SBS, the SAS, and the Long Range Desert Group, and the SOE. He served in all 4 units. And I looked at Jack. He was he's in a wheelchair now. And I said, oh, my God, it's Jack. And he said, it's Damien. So sharp as a pin. And we embraced. And he said, I'm going to be 100 next year. And it was fantastic. But he's the last. So when you can't get that first-hand testimony, the next best thing is you get the families to dig into all that family archive. And, I'm forever getting contacted by families who say, Dad wrote his wartime story, never published it. Can we send it to you? There are several of those manuscripts which lie behind these books. So it's all of that kind of material that is crucial to the ability to tell these stories. And just to get the sense of, because war's about people, it's about characters. That's really what it's all about. That's what people don't want to read about calibers of weaponry. They want to read about people and what it's like to be there. And you can really only get a sense of somebody, if you talk to those that knew him and loved him, if you get my drift. So it's really, really vital you have those people involved, the family members.
Whoosh, I think your words just now about your meeting with Jack Mann, that would have justified coming here in its own right. Thanks a lot. You mentioned about Fraser McCluskey's messages to Paddy Maine, and you pointed out that quite a few of A Company were veterans, originals.
Yep.
C Squadron, which came in, what was their sort of composition?
So C Squadron C Squadron replaced A Squadron in the Morvan. After Paddy Maine makes the call, they really do need to go home. A Squadron were the originals, most of the originals. C Squadron were a much fresher bunch of individuals. But the thing about it is, it's a great question, because actually who was suffering the most? It's the originals, it's the old hands. Johnny Weissman, the guy I described who went to Dijon, bought the eggs from the farm, where the German soldier bought the eggs from the farm. When Paddy Maine gets A Squadron withdrawn, he says to Johnny Weissman, you're done. You will not deploy again. I will not allow you to deploy again. Of course, Johnny Wiseman doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to, but Maine can see it, and he's adamant. So Johnny Wiseman, for the rest of the war, serves in headquarters in the UK. So it's the cumulative effect of what they have seen. And, you know, it's not kind of germane necessarily to the book, but it's something that I don't think we recognise very much. So many of these families, I was talking about the families, how important they are. So many of them, when you talk to them, nearly all of them say, Dad never spoke about the war. Granddad never spoke about the war. And then occasionally someone will say, well, I kept asking. Eventually, one day I got him to say something and he just broke down in tears. And I felt so guilty. Why didn't they speak about the war? We have this myth, I think, we tell ourselves, and we should stop saying it, because it's not true. Oh, it was secret, or they had stiff upper lip. It's not about that at all. They didn't speak about the war because they had PTSD. They were traumatized, and they knew if they spoke about it, that would open the floodgates. And the only way to deal with it, because there was no recognition, no diagnosis, it was shameful, was to bottle it all away. That's the truth about why so many of these individuals never spoke about it. But they would write it down. That's the thing. Because writing it down is therapy. It's self-therapy. It's recognised now as self-therapy for people with PTSD. So they would write it down as a way to exercise the demons. And that's why when people contact me and say, well, my grandfather never spoke about the war, but he did write it down, it's like, wow, there's that gift. We do have the record. Not verbal, but we have it written down.
Perfect.
Can you tell us something we don't know?
Thank you. So the story I told to the gentleman in Newton Ards, and I use the word gentleman advisedly, was this. And if anyone knows this story, please put your hand up, because I don't think many people will. So in all those documents in Paddy Maine's war chest, there was a one-paragraph report. It's a paragraph in a report. I stumbled across it. I thought, no, that mission could never have happened because it's impossible. If I wrote that as a Hollywood movie outline, people would say, great story, but that never happened in real life. So I thought, that can't happen. Never read about it, don't know anything about it, can't be true. Then I found 3 other reports that corroborated it. Okay? Anyway, this is the story. In September 1943, Operation Husky, the landings, Allied landings, southern Italy, soft underbelly of Europe, opening up, Nazi-occupied Europe. 500 Allied troops landing on southern Italy's shores, right? There's a bridgehead formed at Taranto, and amongst all the regular forces, there's a squadron of SAS landed. In fact, it's 2 SAS, not 1 SAS, 2 SAS. So 2 SAS, the 2nd Regiment, formed under Bill Sterling, David Sterling's brother. Okay, so they come ashore. Bridgehead is formed, all completely normal up until now, and then something really weird happens. Guy turns up at the bridgehead, and he says, my name is Zelko, and I'm a Yugoslav partisan. What's a Yugoslav partisan doing in Italy? Well, he says, I've escaped from a concentration camp. And the Allied commanders say, what's a concentration camp? Because obviously we didn't know, certainly not in October 43. And so Zelko starts to explain what a concentration camp is, and we all know what one is, so I don't need to explain it. So the Allied commanders think, well, this is inconceivable. Is it true? Is he telling the truth? This is horrific. Because concentration camps in Italy were not a great deal better than concentration camps in Nazi Germany, okay? And then they say, well, why are you telling us? And Zelko says, because you've landed, because the Allied landings have taken place, they are about to ship all the concentration camp inmates in Pistici, that was the name of the camp, to Nazi Germany. And when they get them all to Nazi Germany, bad things are going to happen for obvious reasons. So then they said, well, why are you telling us? He says, well, something needs to be done. Now, most of the troops there are regular troops. Now, no disrespect to regular troops, they're not trained in that SAS mindset. The SAS mindset is find a male or make one. Think the unthinkable. Nothing is impossible. Whatever your rank is, you can achieve the mission. It's this empowering ethos that they had. And so there's a chap there, the commander of the squadron is a chap called Major Oswald Carey-Elwes, okay, incredible individual. And Raymond Carraud of Operation Gaff fame, Operation Gaff hasn't happened yet, but he's the 2nd in command under under Carey-Elwes, okay? So Carraud and Carey-Elwes step forward, say we'll go. Now, this is Pistici concentration camp is 120 kilometres behind enemy lines, okay? The SAS have got a few jeeps and a few commandeered crappy old Italian vehicles. There's hundreds of concentration camp victims to rescue. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? You can't put them in jeeps. You can't put them in a convoy of crappy old vehicles. There's just not enough space. How are you going to get 120 kilometres behind enemy lines, take the concentration camp and rescue everyone? Anyone got any ideas? I'm open to suggestions. Yes, gentleman there. Sorry? Yes. So they hijacked a train at Chiatona railway station, which lies just to the west of Taranto. They hijacked a train. They put Corourde. And by the way, when Bill Sterling recruited Raymond Corourde, the guy who'd go on to orchestrate Operation Gaff into 2 SAS, because Bill Sterling rightfully had such a high respect for the French Foreign Legion, he said to Corourde, go and recruit as many former French Foreign Legionnaires as you can to 2 SAS. So there was a whole squadron in 2 SAS, which was known as the French Foreign Legion Squadron. I kid you not. So the train is manned up by Corourde and his French Foreign Legion Squadron, the train they hijack at Chiatona railway station, okay? So the plan is they'll steam the train all the way through to Pistici concentration camp. Because the concentration camp guards are expecting a train to turn up, because they're expecting someone to turn up and take everybody to Germany, yeah? Obviously, they'll take it by surprise, right? Then they'll load everyone aboard and steam the train all the way back again. That's the plan. But there's a vital road and rail junction halfway along. If they don't hold that, they can't set the points properly to get the train through, and it's just not feasible. So the second plank of the mission is that Oswald Cary-Elwes, the major, will take a few jeeps and a few men, drive through the enemy lines, get to that road and rail junction, take it by force of arms and hold it for long enough for the train to steam through, get to the concentration camp, load everyone up, steam all the way back again, and get back to Allied lines. And that's exactly what they proceed to do. They rescue 180 concentration camp inmates from Pistici concentration camp. The first person they put aboard the train is the die-hard fascist camp commandant they've captured. They've killed or driven off all the guards. They tell all the concentration camp victims they can't rescue because there's too many, go into the hills because the Allied advance will arrive soon and we'll liberate you. And the rest of them, the 180 they've got aboard the train, they take them back to Allied lines, and it's one of the most, in my view, it is the most unbelievable operation of the Second World War, and it's absolutely true. And not only that, just to go back to that point I was making about families not knowing about anything, do you remember? Yeah? So, Oswald Cary-Elwes' daughter is called Kate. Kate lives in Oxford. About 4 years ago, she contacted me and said, look, we don't know anything about what Daddy did in the war because he never spoke about it, but we've got all this archive in our home in Oxford. Do you come and look at it and just give us any insight you might give? So I travelled up there, I looked through it all, gave them some ideas about what I thought their father might have done. Then, of course, I find out in Paddy, Maine's war chest that her father commanded the Pistici concentration camp raid. So I called her up. And I said to Kate, are you sat down? She said, yes. Why are you asking me if I'm sat down? I said, because I think you need to be sat down. And I told her the whole story. She was in tears at the end, okay? And she said, one thing that makes sense. Daddy used to say to us, the one thing he would admit was that in the SAS, they were taught to drive trains. And now I know why.
What an amazing place to end it. I think a round of applause is due. Just to say finally, there are many ways you can support the National Army Museum. You can visit us here on Wind in Our Cafe, browse the shop, or use the donation points at the front of the museum, or use the shop, as I said, and buy this book. I'll be taking up Damien in a second just to sign some copies. Now, to let you know what's coming up next in the National Army Museum, next week we have James Holland talking about his latest book, Casino 44. That's on Wednesday, as well as we, of course, have our free weekly Friday lectures, with tomorrow's being about the Battle of Minden and a cannonball that changed the course of history. Something completely different to this. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to all see you again soon. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.